There is a particular kind of man who believes he has figured out the important things. Not arrogantly, not loudly, just quietly, privately, in the way that a person who has lived long enough and paid reasonable attention begins to assume that the major lessons are behind him. He has made his mistakes. He has learned from most of them. He knows who he is, what he values, how he treats people. He is not perfect. He would never claim that. But he has arrived, through decades of living, at a working understanding of himself and the world that feels reasonably complete. Robert Deering was that kind of man. He was 71 years old, a retired literature professor from a small liberal arts college in Vermont, which meant he had spent 40 years teaching other people to read carefully, to look beneath the surface of a text, to notice what was said and what was deliberately left unsaid, to understand that the most important things were often carried not in the obvious places, but in the margins, the silences, the choices a writer made about what not to explain. He had published 2 books on American poetry that were still used in graduate seminars. He had been, by any reasonable measure, a man who paid attention. He had also been married twice. His first marriage, to a woman named Carol, had lasted 9 years and ended when they were both 34, young enough that they had rebuilt their lives separately without too much permanent damage, though Robert had carried certain lessons from it that he could still articulate precisely 40 years later. His second marriage, to Eleanor, had been the marriage of his life. 26 years, a daughter named Sophie, who was now 38 and lived in Boston with her husband and 2 children. Travel, conversation, the deep comfort of 2 people who had chosen each other thoroughly and continued choosing each other daily. Eleanor had died 4 years ago, ovarian cancer, 14 months from diagnosis to the end. Robert had done his grieving with the same methodical honesty he brought to everything, not rushing it, not hiding from it, reading everything he could find about loss and finding that none of it was adequate, but all of it was somewhat useful, the way a map is useful, even when it cannot capture the actual terrain. He had come out the other side, not whole. He did not think whole was the right word for what a person was after a loss of that magnitude, but functional, present, still interested in the world. He had not expected, at 71, to find himself sitting across from a woman at a dinner party and feeling something he had not felt in a very long time. The dinner party was at his colleague Richard's house. Richard was emeritus now, like Robert, but they had taught in the same department for 20 years and maintained the easy friendship of men who have argued about books together long enough that the arguments have become a form of affection. The woman across from Robert was named Vivian Marsh. She was 67, recently retired from a career as a clinical psychologist, 35 years of private practice, which meant she had spent 3.5 decades sitting with people in their most unguarded moments, listening to the things they could not say anywhere else. She had the particular quality that good therapists often develop over long careers. A quality of complete, unhurried presence, as if the person she was talking to was the only thing in the room that mattered, and she had nowhere else to be, and she was genuinely, specifically interested. Robert noticed this quality immediately. He noticed most things immediately. It was the occupational habit of a man who had spent 40 years teaching close reading. But this he noticed with something more than professional attention. They talked about books first, which was inevitable given Robert's presence. Vivian read widely and had opinions, which she expressed with the directness of a woman who had spent her career in a room where vagueness was a form of avoidance. She disagreed with Robert about a novel he admired and said so clearly and without apology. He found this, unexpectedly, delightful. They talked about their work. She asked what it had been like to teach literature for 40 years, not as a polite question, but as a genuine one, leaning slightly forward, the way she probably leaned toward patients who were getting to something real. "What did you actually teach them?" she asked. "When it worked?" Robert considered this. To trust that the thing they felt when they read something was real information, he said. That the emotional response to a text is not separate from the intellectual one. That what moves you is telling you something true. Vivian looked at him for a moment. "That's what I try to teach my patients," she said. That their feelings were data, not noise, not weakness, information. Something settled between them at the table, a recognition, the way two people sometimes discover mid-conversation that they have been working on the same problem from different directions for their entire careers. On the drive home, Robert found himself thinking about the conversation with the same close attention he had once given to poems that resisted easy interpretation. He noticed the things she had said. He noticed, just as carefully, the things she hadn't. He called Richard the next morning. "Tell me about Vivian Marsh," he said. Richard, who had seated them across from each other on purpose and was not remotely surprised by this phone call, told him. They had coffee the following week, and the week after. By the third time, the coffee had extended into a walk, and by the fourth, the walk had extended into dinner, and by the fifth, Robert understood that something was happening that he had not planned for and did not entirely know how to navigate. He was, by his own admission, a man who understood texts better than people. He understood people reasonably well, better than average, he thought, with the appropriate humility. But there was a layer of human communication, particularly between men and women, that he had always found slightly opaque. He had managed well enough in 2 marriages by being fundamentally decent and paying attention and genuinely caring. But he understood, sitting across from Vivian Marsh at dinner for the 4th time, that decent and attentive and caring, while necessary, were not sufficient. There was something he was missing. He knew this the way he sometimes knew a poem was doing something he hadn't fully grasped yet, from the presence of a feeling he couldn't account for, a sense that the text was richer than his reading of it, that something important was happening in the margins. He was too old and too honest with himself to pretend otherwise. So he did what he had always done when he encountered something he didn't understand. He studied. He started, characteristically, with books. He read everything he could find on the psychology of intimacy. Not the shallow kind, not the self-help variety that reduced human complexity to numbered lists and actionable steps, but the serious kind, the clinical literature, the research. He read attachment theory and the work on emotional attunement and studies on what women in long-term relationships consistently identified as the most important elements of genuine closeness. And then, because he was also a practical man, he called his daughter. Sophie was 38, a family medicine physician in Boston, and she had her mother Eleanor's precision and her father's habit of examining things until they yielded their meaning. She was also, Robert knew, a woman who would tell him the truth without managing it, who had learned, growing up with a literature professor father, that honesty was a form of respect. "I need to understand something," Robert told her, "about what intimacy actually means to a woman. Not what I assume it means, what it actually is." Sophie was quiet for a moment, the specific silence of a daughter recalibrating a conversation with her father. Then she said, "All right, tell me what you know and I'll tell you what you're missing." What followed was a conversation Robert thought about for weeks. Sophie spoke from her own experience, from her clinical knowledge, and from the frank perspective of a woman in a long marriage who had thought carefully about what made it work. And what she described, the 5 things she kept returning to, rearranged something fundamental in the way Robert understood the person sitting across from him at dinner. The first truth, Sophie said, was that emotional safety is the foundation of everything else. Not comfort, safety. There was a difference. Comfort was the absence of friction. Safety was something active. It was the knowledge, built through consistent evidence over time, that this person would not use your vulnerability against you, that what you said in an unguarded moment would not become ammunition, that you could be less than your best self without losing the relationship. Women, Sophie said, spend a great deal of energy in most of their lives managing how they are perceived. With someone they truly trust, they can stop managing. That experience of being allowed to stop is what most women mean when they say they feel close to someone. Not proximity, relief. Robert thought about Eleanor. He thought about the specific quality of their evenings together, her habit of saying things at dinner that she had clearly been carrying all day, the way she would exhale slightly as she said them, as if the house and his presence were a place where she could put things down. He had always thought of that as ordinary. He understood now it was the highest thing. The second truth was that women experience intimacy through conversation in a way that men often don't. Not just talking, a specific kind of talking, the kind where the other person is genuinely curious about your inner experience rather than waiting for the practical conclusion. Sophie put it plainly. When Mom used to tell you about her day, what were you listening for? Robert thought about it. Whether there was a problem I could help with, he admitted. Right, Sophie said, and most of the time there wasn't a problem. There was just an experience she wanted to share, and the sharing was the point, the witnessing. She paused. A woman feels close to a man who asks a follow-up question, not because he needs the information, because he wants to know more about what she's experiencing. That's the intimacy, the interest. The third truth was one that surprised Robert most. Sophie called it the intimacy of being known in small ways. Not grand gestures, not dramatic declarations, the small specific things. Remembering that she takes her tea a particular way, noticing when she's tired before she says so, knowing which topics light her up and steering conversation toward them, knowing which memories she returns to when she's troubled. Intimacy, Sophie said, is largely made of specificity. The feeling of being known, really known, in the small details that most people don't bother with, is one of the most powerful experiences of closeness a person can have. And it costs almost nothing except attention. The fourth truth was about physical presence as communication. Not physical intimacy in the obvious sense, something quieter than that. The hand on the shoulder in passing, sitting close enough that the physical proximity is a choice and not an accident. The language the body speaks when words aren't being used. A woman knows, Sophie said, whether the person beside her is present or absent. You can be in the same room and miles away. You can be across a table and completely there. She feels the difference. It registers somewhere beneath conscious thought. She paused. Are you present with her, Dad? Actually present? Robert thought about the dinners with Vivienne. He thought about the moments when he had been most fully there, not thinking about what to say next, not reviewing the conversation for its subtext, just listening, and the way those moments had a different quality from the others, a different texture. Sometimes, he said honestly, not always. That's the work, Sophie said simply. The fifth truth was the one Sophie said took her longest to understand herself and which she thought most men never learned at all. She called it the power of being chosen daily. Not once, not at the beginning, daily. A woman doesn't need grand romantic gestures, Sophie said. She needs to feel that the man beside her still wants to be beside her. Not because they have a history, not because it's convenient, because today, on this ordinary day, he looked at her and chose her. She paused. It's the smallest thing, a look that says, you. It's still you. I still see you. It costs nothing and it means everything, and most men stop doing it after the first year because they assume the woman already knows. Another pause. She knows you love her. She wants to feel it. Robert sat with all 5 truths for a long moment. Then he said, I missed all of this with Eleanor. Not all of it, Sophie said gently. You were present more than you knew, But some of it, yes. Mom knew you loved her completely. She also sometimes wanted you to look up from your book and say something that was only for her. Robert absorbed this. Don't do it again, Sophie said, not harshly, as the most loving thing she could say. He went to meet Vivian for their fifth dinner with 5 things written on a card in his shirt pocket that he did not need to look at because he had read them until they were part of him. He arrived before her and was standing outside the restaurant when she came down the sidewalk in the October evening, and he watched her approach with the complete and unhurried attention of a man who had decided to be fully present. And when she reached him, he said, simply and specifically, "You look like yourself tonight. I mean that as the best possible thing." Vivian stopped, looked at him with an expression he was beginning to know, the one where she was deciding whether he was doing the thing he appeared to be doing. "That might be the most specific compliment I've received in years," she said. "I've been studying," Robert said. She laughed, fully, the way she laughed when something genuinely surprised her. "Have you?" "I'm a slow learner about certain things," he said, "but thorough." She took his arm as they went inside, which she had not done before, and Robert understood this was not nothing. What changed between Robert and Vivian over the following months was not dramatic. That was the first thing Robert understood, that the 5 truths Sophie had given him did not produce transformation. They produced something quieter and more durable. They changed the texture of ordinary evenings. They changed the quality of his attention in small moments, the moments that accumulated over time into the substance of a life shared with another person. He practiced asking the second question, not the polite question, the follow-up. When Vivian told him about her day, he listened for what mattered to her about it, and then asked about that specifically. She was writing a book, a memoir of sorts, drawn from 3 decades of clinical practice, exploring what she had learned about human beings from sitting with them in their most unguarded hours. She talked about it cautiously at first, the way people talk about things that matter to them a great deal and are therefore slightly afraid of. Robert listened without waiting for the conclusion. He asked what section she was working on. He asked what was hard about it. He asked what she wanted the book to ultimately say. The third time he asked one of these questions, Vivian put down her fork and looked at him. "Most people," she said, "when I tell them about the book, want to know when it will be finished, or who the publisher is, or whether it will sell." "Those are practical questions," Robert said. "Yes," she said, "you ask different ones." "I want to know what you're thinking about," he said simply. "The practical things are beside the point." Vivian looked at him for a moment in the particular way she had, direct and measuring, and, when something registered, slightly softer than before. "That," she said quietly, "is an intimacy." Robert understood exactly what she meant. He practiced presence, the 4th truth, with deliberate, almost disciplined attention. He had spent a lifetime partially in his own head, reviewing and analyzing and processing even while sitting across from someone. He worked, consciously and not always successfully, at being in the room he was actually in, at letting the conversation be what it was rather than what he was making of it. Sophie had told him, she feels the difference. He believed this. He was beginning to experience it from the other direction, the way Vivian's own presence seemed to deepen in the moments when his was most complete. As if full attention called forth full attention in return. And he practiced the 5th truth, the daily choosing, in the smallest possible ways. A text in the middle of an afternoon that said nothing urgent, just, "I was just thinking about what you said last week about memory. You were right." Arriving to meet her and saying something specific, not, "You look nice," but something that demonstrated he had been paying attention to her specifically and not women in general. Looking at her sometimes in the middle of an ordinary conversation with the simple intention of letting her feel seen. He was not perfect at any of this. He lapsed, he retreated into his head. He gave the practical answer when the emotional one was what the moment needed. He was 71 years old and had habits of a lifetime that did not dissolve because he had read 5 truths on a card. But he kept returning to them. And Vivian, who was, after all, a clinical psychologist who had spent 35 years understanding human behavior, noticed. One evening in November, they were sitting in his living room after dinner. Robert had a fire going. The Vermont nights had turned properly cold, and Vivian was reading on the couch while he read in the armchair, which had become, without discussion, a comfortable pattern. The silence between them was the inhabited kind, full, the kind that required nothing from either of them. Vivian looked up from her book. "Can I tell you something?" she said. "Of course," Robert said. "I've been watching you change," she said. "Since we started spending time together, something has shifted in the way you're present." She held his gaze. "I don't know what happened or what prompted it, but I feel it." Robert set down his book. He thought about Sophie on the phone, about 5 truths and a card in a shirt pocket, about Eleanor and the evenings he had half inhabited, and the ones, more than he had counted, that he had been fully there. "My daughter told me some things," he said, "about what intimacy actually means, to a woman, what it's made of." Vivian was quiet for a moment. "What did she tell you?" He told her all 5 truths, not from the card, from memory, in his own words, which were not Sophie's words, but had become, over weeks of thinking about them, his own. Safety. Conversation that witnesses rather than solves. The intimacy of small knowing. Presence as its own language. The daily choosing. When he finished, Vivian was quiet for a long moment. "She's a wise woman, your daughter," she said. "She is," Robert said. "She told me not to miss it again." "Miss what?" "The thing that's actually happening," he said. "In the margins, in the small moments." He looked at her steadily. The real text. Vivian smiled, the full one, unguarded, the one that changed her whole face. "A literature professor," she said. "Of course you'd put it that way." "It's the only framework I have," Robert said. "But it works." She returned to her book. He returned to his. The fire settled. The Vermont night pressed quietly against the windows. And Robert Deering, 71 years old, retired professor, a man who had spent his career teaching others to read what was actually there, sat in his own living room and felt the particular satisfaction of finally, at this late and unexpected hour, reading his own life correctly. Not a grand revelation, not a transformation, just a man paying the right kind of attention at last. In the spring, Sophie came to visit. She met Vivian for the first time at dinner, and the 2 women talked for 2 hours with the easy, immediate warmth of people who have both spent their lives paying close attention to other people and recognize that quality across a table. On the drive back from the restaurant, Sophie sat beside her father and said nothing for a while. Then she said, "You're different with her." "I know," Robert said. "You're present," she said. "Actually present." "I'm trying," he said. Sophie looked out the window at the Vermont spring, the maples coming green, the last light over the hills. "Mom would have been glad," she said quietly, not as a comparison, as a blessing. Robert drove in silence for a moment. "I know," he said, and meant it completely. He thought about 5 truths written on a card he no longer needed, about the margins of a text and what lived there, about the difference between reading something and understanding it, the gap between knowing a thing intellectually and carrying it in your body, in your daily choices, in the way you looked at a person across a room. He had spent 40 years teaching that gap to students. He had needed 71 years to cross it himself. Better late, he thought, than the alternative.